July 1968, Arthur Rock sat in his San Francisco office overlooking the bay. When the phone rang, he heard the voice of Bob Noyce on the other end. Noyce was a physicist, co-inventor of the integrated circuit, and one of the most respected minds in semiconductors. They were more than business associates. They were friends who hiked together in the Sierras, camped under the stars, and talked about everything from transistors to Thoro. Noyce's voice carried that characteristic mix of Midwestern directness and visionary enthusiasm. "Arthur," he said, "Gordon and I are ready to do it. We're leaving Fairchild. We want to start our own company." Rock didn't ask for a business plan. He didn't request financial projections or market analysis. He asked one question. "What do you need?" When Noyce replied, $2.5 million, Rock's response was immediate. "Give me the afternoon." By 5 p.m. that day, Rock had made 15 phone calls and raised the money. 2 hours to secure $2.5 million, a sum worth over $20 million today, with nothing more than a page-and-a-half memo and Bob Noyce's reputation. The company they were funding hadn't even been named yet, but within weeks, it would be called Intel Corporation. This wasn't luck or chance. It was Arthur Rock's philosophy distilled to its essence. Bet on extraordinary people, move with conviction, and trust what you know about character. By 1968, Rock had already revolutionized American capitalism once by helping 8 rebellious scientists break away from a Nobel laureate and form Fairchild Semiconductor, the company that would spawn Silicon Valley itself. Now he was about to do it again. But the story of how Arthur Rock became the man Bob Noyce called when he wanted to change the world begins much earlier, and much more humbly, in a small candy store in upstate New York. On August 19, 1926, Arthur Rock entered a world in the midst of the Roaring Twenties. America buzzed with prosperity that seemed endless, a stock market that climbed relentlessly, and optimism about technology, industry, and progress. In Rochester, New York, Eastman Kodak dominated the landscape as a technology giant that had made the city synonymous with American innovation. Yet Arthur Rock was born into a different world than Kodak's executive mansions. He was the only child of Hyman and Reva Cohen Rock, Jewish immigrants navigating life in industrial America. His father owned a small candy store, the kind of mom-and-pop operation that required 14-hour days, 7 days a week, just to keep the lights on and food on the table. The candy store wasn't glamorous, but it was instructive. Young Arthur spent his childhood behind the counter, watching his father work, learning about inventory, about customers, about the razor-thin margins that separated survival from failure. He learned what hard work looked like when you had no safety net. He learned that capital mattered, that the difference between opportunity and stagnation often came down to having enough money at the right time. Rochester in the 1930s was a city of contrasts. Kodak represented industrial might and technological sophistication, but the Great Depression, which arrived when Arthur was 3 years old, revealed how fragile prosperity could be. Unemployment reached 25%. Banks collapsed by the thousands. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. The Rock family's candy store survived, but barely. The experience imprinted on young Arthur. He saw how economic forces beyond anyone's control could devastate lives. He saw that those with capital could weather storms that drowned others. Arthur came of age as the world descended into chaos. By the time he graduated high school in 1944, World War II had consumed the planet. Like millions of young American men, Arthur was drafted into the U.S. Army at 18 years old. But Arthur's war ended before it began. He completed his basic training, but the war concluded before he could be deployed overseas. Instead of seeing combat, he became part of the massive post-war generation of veterans returning home with a simple but transformative piece of legislation in their pockets, the GI Bill. The GI Bill changed Arthur Rock's life trajectory and, by extension, the trajectory of American technology. Without it, the son of a candy store owner might never have attended college, let alone earned a graduate degree from Harvard. The legislation that sent 8 million veterans to college democratized American opportunity in a way nothing before it had. Arthur was one of its beneficiaries. He would never forget that access to capital, in this case government funding for education, was the difference between trapped potential and realized achievement. Arthur enrolled at Syracuse University in 1946, using his GI Bill benefits to study business administration. Syracuse wasn't Harvard or Yale, but it was pragmatic and rigorous, training students for the actual work of American commerce rather than the theoretical contemplation of it. What Arthur discovered at Syracuse was that he had an aptitude for numbers and analysis, but more importantly, an intuition for people and situations that couldn't be reduced to spreadsheets. He wasn't the most gregarious student, but he was observant. He listened. He absorbed not just the mechanics of accounting and finance, but the underlying logic of how businesses worked, how value was created, how risk was managed. Syracuse in the late 1940s was filled with veterans like Arthur, men a few years older than traditional undergraduates, more serious, more focused. They'd seen war or prepared for it, and they weren't interested in fraternity parties. They were interested in building careers. This peer group shaped Arthur's worldview. Ambition was good. Hard work was expected. The point of education was to create economic opportunity. Syracuse in the late 1940s was filled with veterans like Arthur, men a few years older than traditional undergraduates, more serious, more focused. They'd seen war or prepared for it, and they weren't interested in fraternity parties. They were interested in building careers. This peer group shaped Arthur's worldview. Ambition was good. Hard work was expected. The point of education was to create economic opportunity. He graduated in 1948 with his BA in Business Administration at 22 years old, having proven he could do the work. Now the question was, what kind of work would he do? Getting into Harvard Business School in 1949 was transformative. This wasn't Syracuse. This was the elite training ground for American business leaders. The students came from wealth, from prep schools, from families with connections stretching into the highest reaches of finance and industry. Arthur Rock, son of a Rochester candy store owner, was an outsider in this world, but he belonged academically. Harvard Business School in the early 1950s was explicitly focused on creating general managers for large corporations. The curriculum emphasized the case method, learning by analyzing real business situations and making decisions under uncertainty. For Arthur, this approach clicked. He wasn't just memorizing formulas. He was developing judgment. What struck Arthur most at Harvard was the sheer scale of American business. In case after case, he studied companies with thousands of employees, millions in revenue, complex operations spanning continents. The candy store had taught him about margins and customers. Harvard taught him about capital allocation, strategic planning, and the enormous power that flowed to those who controlled investment decisions. He also made connections that would last a lifetime. His classmates included future business leaders across industries, including Fayez Sarofim, who would later become one of the largest shareholders in Kinder Morgan and an early limited partner in Arthur's venture capital fund. Harvard wasn't just an education. It was entry into a network. Arthur earned his MBA in 1951 at 25 years old with the credential he needed. The question now was where to deploy it. Fresh out of Harvard, Arthur Rock landed in New York City at Hayden Stone and Company, a respected investment banking firm with roots stretching back to 1892. He started as a securities analyst, someone who evaluated companies, assessed their financial health, and recommended whether they were good investments. This was Wall Street in the 1950s, before computers, before Bloomberg terminals, before any of the infrastructure that would later make information ubiquitous. Analysis meant reading annual reports, visiting companies, talking to management, and using your judgment. Arthur was good at it. What made Arthur unusual was his interest in technology companies. Most Wall Street analysts focused on established industries. Railroads, utilities, manufacturing, retail. Businesses that were predictable, stable, comprehensible. Technology, especially the emerging semiconductor industry, was none of those things. It was new, complex, rapidly changing. Most bankers didn't understand it and didn't want to. But Arthur was drawn to it precisely because it was frontier territory. He taught himself about transistors, about the physics of semiconductors, about the companies trying to commercialize this new science. He didn't have a technical background. He was a finance guy. But he had something more useful, the ability to assess whether the people running these companies knew what they were doing and had the drive to succeed. By the mid-1950s, Arthur had moved into Hayden Stone's corporate finance department, where he worked on raising money for small technology companies. This was unglamorous work. Most of these companies were unknown. Their products were experimental. Convincing investors to part with money required both technical understanding and persuasive ability. Arthur developed a reputation for being able to spot promising companies in confusing industries. But more than that, he developed a philosophy. Technical brilliance didn't matter if management was weak. Great products failed all the time because the people building them didn't know how to run a business. The companies that succeeded had something else, what Arthur would later call fire in the belly and intellect. Passion combined with capability. Drive tempered by judgment. In the summer of 1957, Arthur Rock was 31 years old and successful by conventional standards. A Harvard MBA, a solid position at a respected firm, a growing expertise in a promising field. He could have stayed on this trajectory and built a comfortable Wall Street career. Then a letter arrived that would change everything. One of Hayden Stone's clients was a scientist named Eugene Kleiner, who worked at Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Palo Alto, California. Kleiner's father, worried about his son's situation, wrote to his broker at Hayden Stone asking if anyone could help. Eugene and 7 colleagues wanted to leave their jobs. They weren't happy working for William Shockley, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had invented the transistor and then founded a company to commercialize it. The letter got passed around the office and eventually landed on Arthur Rock's desk. He read it and saw something others might have missed. These weren't just any scientists. These were the protégés of William Shockley, arguably the most important physicist in America. If they were dissatisfied enough to leave, and if they were good enough that Shockley had hired them in the first place, they were worth talking to. Arthur showed the letter to his boss, Alfred Bud Coyle, and together they decided to fly to California to meet these scientists. This decision, to invest time and plane fare to investigate a complaint from disgruntled employees, would change Arthur Rock's life and, with it, the course of American technology. Arthur Rock was 31 years old when he first flew to California in 1957. Single, ambitious, and positioned comfortably in New York finance. California was the frontier, literally and metaphorically. The technology industry didn't exist as we know it today. The term Silicon Valley hadn't been coined. Palo Alto was a sleepy university town surrounded by fruit orchards, not the epicenter of global innovation. But something was happening in that sleepy town. William Shockley, brilliant and erratic, had decided to return to his hometown after winning the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the transistor. He'd recruited a team of young PhDs and set out to build a company that would commercialize semiconductor technology. The future of computing, electronics, and much of modern civilization would depend on semiconductors. Shockley knew this. So did his recruits. What they didn't anticipate was that Shockley, genius physicist, was a terrible manager. In September 1957, Arthur Rock and Bud Coyle flew to San Francisco and made their way to Palo Alto. The meeting was set for the Redwood Room at the Clift Hotel in downtown San Francisco. One by one, 8 young men arrived. Julius Blank, Victor Greenwich, Gene Horney, Eugene Kleiner, Jay Last, Gordon Moore, Robert Noyce, and Sheldon Roberts. They were impressive. 6 had PhDs. They'd been recruited by William Shockley himself. But they were miserable. Shockley, they explained, was paranoid and authoritarian. He'd accused them of sabotage and administered lie detector tests. His research direction was questionable. His management was intolerable. They tried to go above his head to the company's owner, Arnold Beckman, asking him to remove Shockley from management. Beckman had refused. So they wanted to leave, all 8 of them, together. What they wanted from Rock and Coyle was help finding a company that would hire them as a group so they could continue working on silicon semiconductor technology. Rock listened to their proposal and immediately saw the flaw. Any established company would want to control them, integrate them into existing structures, constrain their autonomy. They'd end up frustrated again. Rock had a different idea. Why don't you start your own company? The suggestion was radical. None of the 8 had business experience. None had capital. The model for how scientists could become entrepreneurs didn't really exist yet. But Rock saw something. These were exactly the kind of people who could build something extraordinary if given the chance. They had world-class technical expertise. They had conviction about what technology mattered. Most importantly, they had the fire in their belly. They cared enough to risk their careers by walking away from Shockley. At the end of the meeting, Bud Coyle pulled out 10 $1 bills and asked each of the 8 scientists, plus Rock and himself, to sign all 10 bills. Each person kept one bill signed by everyone. It was a contract, informal, symbolic, but binding in the way that mattered. They were committed to each other. Rock's investment thesis for what would become Fairchild Semiconductor was simple. These people were exceptional. Exceptional people executing in an important emerging field would create enormous value. He didn't have a detailed business plan. The scientists had ideas about making better silicon transistors, but the specific products, the market strategy, the path to profitability were all uncertain. What wasn't uncertain was the quality of the team. Rock understood something that most investors didn't. In brand new industries, conventional business planning was impossible because no one knew what the market would look like in 5 years. What mattered was having the right people positioned in the right emerging field with the capability to adapt as the future revealed itself. Rock returned to New York and began pitching the idea to potential investors. He contacted every major technology company he could think of. IBM, GE, RCA, Bell Labs, and dozens more. The pitch was straightforward. Invest in these 8 brilliant scientists leaving Shockley, and you'll be positioned at the forefront of semiconductor technology. 35 companies said no. The idea was too strange. Scientists don't start companies. There's no proven market. Why are they leaving Shockley? What's wrong with them? The rejections piled up. Rock was running out of options. Then someone mentioned Sherman Fairchild, an interesting character. Playboy inventor, son of an IBM founder, wealthy eccentric who ran Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation. Fairchild had an instinct for technology and wasn't afraid of unconventional ideas. Rock got a meeting. Fairchild understood immediately. He agreed to provide $1.5 million, structured as a loan to the new company, Fairchild Semiconductor, with an option to buy the entire company for $3 million if it succeeded. Each of the 8 scientists received 100 shares in the company, about 10% ownership total. Hayden Stone received 225 shares, about 22.5%, for arranging the deal. The structure was important because it gave the scientists meaningful ownership, unprecedented for employees in 1957. It aligned everyone's incentives and created what would become the template for future venture deals. On September 18, 1957, Fairchild Semiconductor was incorporated. 12 days later, they opened an office in Mountain View, just 12 blocks from Shockley's lab. The Traitorous 8, as Shockley bitterly called them, were in business. The early months tested everything. The 8 scientists had to become managers. Hiring people, establishing manufacturing processes, making payroll, dealing with customers. Robert Noyce emerged as the leader. He had the technical brilliance combined with social skills and strategic thinking that held the group together. Their first product, silicon mesotransistors, hit the market in 1958 and were better than the competition's. They sold well enough to establish the company's credibility. But the real breakthrough came with Gene Horney's invention of the planar process, a manufacturing technique that made semiconductors more reliable and easier to produce at scale. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was the foundation of the modern chip industry. By 1959, Fairchild Semiconductor was generating significant revenue and winning major contracts, including from the US military for the Minuteman missile guidance system. The company's technology was demonstrably superior. The 8 were proving they could execute. Rock, watching from New York, saw validation of his thesis. Great people in an emerging important field would figure out how to succeed. In September 1959, just 2 years after founding, Fairchild Camera and Instrument exercised its option to buy out Fairchild Semiconductor for $3 million. Each of the 8 scientists received approximately $300,000, roughly $3.25 million in today's dollars. Life-changing money for young men in their 20s and 30s. For Rock and Hayden Stone, the returns were exceptional. The firm had put minimal capital at risk and earned substantial fees plus equity value. But the financial return, significant as it was, understated the deal's true importance. Fairchild Semiconductor established patents that would define venture capital for generations to come. Rock had bet on extraordinary people over business plans. He gave the 8 founders meaningful ownership that created alignment and motivated them to build lasting value. He didn't just write a check. He provided guidance, made introductions, helped with corporate structure, acting as a partner in building the company rather than a passive investor. Within a few years, Fairchild employees would leave to start their own companies. Intel, AMD, National Semiconductor, and dozens more. Rock's investment in Fairchild was really an investment in the entire ecosystem that would become Silicon Valley. More personally, Rock learned that this work, finding brilliant people with important ideas and helping them build companies, was more satisfying than traditional Wall Street banking. He wasn't just analyzing securities. He was helping create new industries. He'd found his calling. In 1961, Arthur Rock made a decision that permanently altered his trajectory. He left New York and moved to California. He was 35 years old, leaving behind the security and prestige of Wall Street for the uncertainty of the West Coast. His family thought he was crazy. Rock partnered with Tommy Davis Jr., forming Davis and Rock, one of the first dedicated venture capital firms in history. They raised $5 million, tiny by today's standards, but significant for 1961. Rock invested $175,000 of his own money. The rest came primarily from Rock's network of wealthy East Coast investors. The firm operated simply. Davis was the extrovert, talkative, enthusiastic, great at selling and relationship building. Rock was the introvert, analytical, quiet, focused on deep understanding of people and situations. They complemented each other perfectly. Rock rented a modest office in San Francisco. He didn't try to build an empire. He wanted to invest in a few companies per year, work closely with their founders, and help build businesses that mattered. From 1961 to 1968, Davis and Rock would invest in only 15 companies. But those 15 investments would return $100 million on $3 million invested, a 33 times return that established Rock as a legendary investor. Rock's investment philosophy during the Davis and Rock years crystallized into principles that would guide him for life. His core thesis was captured in his own words. "I get my kicks out of building companies. Anyone who comes into the office and says they have a business plan that will make me a lot of money doesn't stand another 2 or 3 minutes with me. It's about building companies." Rock inverted the typical investment process. He didn't start with markets or products. He started with people. His questions were fundamental. Do they have fire in their belly and intellect? Are they building something because they're passionate about it, or just to make money? Can they attract great people to work with them? Will they tell me the truth when things go wrong? Do they have the drive to push through inevitable obstacles? Rock spent enormous amounts of time with potential investments before committing. He'd meet entrepreneurs multiple times, in different settings, asking the same questions repeatedly to see if answers stayed consistent. He was looking for character, not just capability. Rock also established geographic discipline. He only invested in companies near San Francisco because he wanted to be able to visit easily, attend board meetings, and provide hands-on help. This wasn't passive investment. It was active company building. Rock's first major investment after forming Davis and Rock was in a company called Teledyne, founded by Henry Singleton. Singleton was unusual, a brilliant engineer with a PhD from MIT who'd risen to vice president at Litton Industries. Singleton saw how conglomerates worked. Acquire companies, provide capital and management expertise, create value through operational improvement and financial engineering. His vision for Teledyne was to build a technology-focused conglomerate, starting in aerospace and electronics, then expanding opportunistically. Rock's thesis was simple. Singleton was one of the smartest people he'd ever met. Singleton had learned the conglomerate business inside a successful operator. If anyone could build the next great industrial conglomerate, it was Singleton. Davis and Rock invested early in Teledyne. Rock joined the board, where he'd served for 34 years. Singleton proved to be an exceptional capital allocator. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Teledyne stock significantly outperformed the market. Warren Buffett would later cite Singleton as one of the best managers he'd ever studied. Teledyne demonstrated that Rock's model worked. Find exceptional people, back them in businesses where their skills were relevant, support them actively, and get out of their way. Teledyne confirmed Rock's belief that the quality of the CEO was the single most important variable in investment success. In 1961, Rock met Max Palevsky, a mathematician and engineer who'd worked at Packard Bell. Palevsky had a vision: build scientific computers that were powerful but cheaper than IBM's offerings. The target market was universities, research labs, and engineering departments. Customers who needed computing power but couldn't afford IBM's prices. Palevsky was unusual. Technically brilliant but also charming, persuasive, and entrepreneurial. Rock later described him as the first executive he ever came across who didn't wear a tie. His style was easygoing, slap you on the back, put your feet up on the table. Rock's thesis for scientific data systems was that computing would grow explosively, and IBM couldn't serve every market segment. There was room for focused competitors. More importantly, Rock believed in Palevsky. He was convinced that he was going to make money. Very few people turned him on the way Palevsky did. Davis and Rock invested $257,000 in SDS. Palevsky used the capital to hire engineers, build prototypes, and secure initial customers. The SDS computers found their niche quickly. Universities and research institutions wanted the power but didn't need IBM's enterprise support infrastructure. SDS grew explosively. Revenue went from $1 million to $100 million in just a few years. The company went public successfully. Rock served on the board, providing strategic advice and connections. In 1969, Xerox Corporation acquired SDS for $920 million, a stunning price. Rock's $257,000 investment had grown to approximately $60 million. The return was approximately 233 times on invested capital, with later estimates suggesting closer to 380 times. SDS became one of the defining investments of Davis and Rock's track record. It showed that venture capital, done right, could generate life-changing returns. It showed that Rock's judgment about people was his true edge. By 1968, Davis and Rock had become legendary. 7 years, 15 investments, $3 million invested, $100 million returned. Rock was 42 years old and at the peak of his abilities. Davis and Rock decided to dissolve the partnership amicably. Tommy Davis wanted to continue raising and managing larger funds. Rock wanted something different. He wanted to invest primarily his own money and that of a few close friends, make even fewer deals, and work even more closely with the companies he backed. In 1969, Rock founded Arthur Rock & Company with a staff consisting of one person, Marie Getchell, his longtime secretary. That was it. No analysts, no associates, no infrastructure. Rock operated out of a small office in San Francisco, making 3 to 4 investments per year, serving on the boards of his portfolio companies, staying hands-on, present, and involved. This model was radical. Most successful investors were building firms, raising larger funds, and expanding. Rock was doing the opposite, deliberately staying small, maintaining intimacy with his investments, optimizing for joy and impact rather than assets under management. It worked because Rock had something irreplaceable: reputation. When Bob Noyce called in 1968 about starting Intel, he didn't call a venture capital firm. He called Arthur Rock personally. That personal connection was worth more than any amount of institutional infrastructure. By 1968, Arthur Rock had been in California for 7 years. He'd married his first wife in a marriage that would later end. He lived in San Francisco overlooking the bay. He hiked and camped with friends in the Sierra Nevada mountains. He'd built relationships with the best technologists in the emerging semiconductor industry. One of those friends was Bob Noyce. Rock was 42, financially secure, and selective. He didn't need to make investments for money. He could be completely selective about people and opportunities. This freedom allowed him to focus only on what he called opportunities that seemed to have no limit, businesses that could become enormous. In July 1968, Bob Noyce called Arthur Rock from Mountain View. The conversation was brief. Noyce and Gordon Moore were leaving Fairchild Semiconductor, frustrated with the parent company's East Coast management. They wanted to start their own company focused on semiconductor memory. Noyce asked, "Arthur, can you help us raise money?" Rock's answer was immediate. "What do you need?" When Noyce replied, "About $2.5 million, Rock said simply, "Give me the afternoon." Rock's thesis for Intel was the simplest and most powerful of his career. Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore were the two best people in the semiconductor industry. They were starting a company in the most important technology of the era. That's all he needed to know. Rock later reflected, "It was one of the few times that I helped start a company that I absolutely knew in my own mind was going to be a big success." His certainty came from multiple sources. Noyce's brilliance and leadership were unquestioned. He was co-inventor of the integrated circuit, a founder of Fairchild Semiconductor, and universally respected in the industry. Moore's technical vision was equally impressive. He'd already articulated what would become known as Moore's Law. The market opportunity was massive. Computing was exploding. Memory was the fundamental building block. Whoever could make cheaper, denser, more reliable memory would capture enormous value. Rock had watched both men build Fairchild Semiconductor from nothing into the industry leader. Most importantly, Rock and Noyce were friends who hiked together. Rock knew Noyce's character, his integrity, his judgment. This wasn't a business relationship. It was built on years of personal connection and mutual trust. Rock hung up the phone with Noyce and started making calls. He had a page-and-a-half memo about the new company. Barely more than a description. No detailed business plan. No financial projections. Just, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore are starting a semiconductor memory company, and Arthur Rock is investing. That was enough. Rock made 15 phone calls that afternoon. By 5 p.m., he'd raised $2.5 million in convertible debentures. The money came from a limited group of private investors, wealthy individuals who trusted Rock's judgment and wanted access to his deals. The speed became legendary. 2 hours to raise $2.5 million. It epitomized Rock's reputation. When Arthur Rock called with a deal, you said yes immediately or someone else would take your allocation. Intel was incorporated on July 18, 1968. Bob Noyce received 245,000 shares. Gordon Moore received 245,000 shares. Arthur Rock took 10,000 shares. The founders owned nearly 50% of the company from day one. Unprecedented alignment that maximized founders' motivation. Rock became Intel's first chairman of the board, a position he'd hold for decades. His role was strategic counsel, governance oversight, and protecting the founders' autonomy to execute their vision. Intel's early years validated Rock's thesis instantly. The company's first product, semiconductor memory chips, found immediate market demand. By 1971, Intel had developed the 400 microprocessor, the first commercial microprocessor, which would become far more important than memory and ultimately define the company's future. The 1970s brought challenges. Japanese semiconductor companies flooded the memory market with cheaper products. Intel faced an existential crisis. Should they stay in memory, their original business, or pivot to microprocessors, a smaller but growing market? Rock's role during this period was critical. He supported management's difficult decision to exit memory and focus on microprocessors. This strategic pivot, made in the mid-1980s under CEO Andy Grove, saved Intel and positioned it to dominate the computing industry for decades. Intel went public in 1971 at $23.50 per share. Rock's 10,000 shares were worth $235,000. But that was just the beginning. Over the following decades, Intel's stock appreciated astronomically as the company became the dominant force in microprocessors. An investment of $10,000 in Intel's 1971 IPO would be worth approximately $12 million by the 2010s. Rock's personal wealth from Intel is estimated to have been in the hundreds of millions of dollars over his lifetime. Rock remained on Intel's board for over 30 years, serving as chairman of the executive committee, and lead director at various times. He was there for the invention of the microprocessor, the pivot from memory to processors, the IBM PC's adoption of Intel chips, and Intel's dominance of the computing industry. Rock's work with Intel led him to observe a corollary to Moore's law, which became known as Rock's law. The cost of a semiconductor fabrication plant doubles every 4 years. This observation had profound implications. As chip manufacturing costs exploded, reaching $20 billion or more by the 2020s, it created enormous barriers to entry. Intel taught Rock that when all the elements align, extraordinary people, huge market, perfect timing, and deep personal trust, the returns can be almost unlimited. Intel validated Rock's life's work. The model of finding brilliant people and backing them with capital, governance, and wisdom could create companies that changed the world. In 1978, Mike Markula, Intel's former marketing vice president, called Arthur Rock. Markula had recently joined a small startup in Cupertino called Apple Computer, founded by two young guys building personal computers in a garage. Markula thought Apple could be huge and wanted Rock to meet the founders. Rock was 52 years old and had been investing for 20 years. He'd seen thousands of entrepreneurs and had strong instincts about people. When he met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, his instincts told him no. They turned me off as people, Rock later admitted. Jobs was 23. Intense, unwashed, barefoot, arrogant. Wozniak was shy, awkward, more interested in engineering than business. Neither fit Rock's model of the driven, credible, managerially capable entrepreneurs he typically backed. But Rock also trusted Mike Markula, who was brilliant, experienced, and had already invested his own money and quit Intel to work with Jobs and Wozniak full-time. That endorsement mattered. Rock's investment thesis for Apple was unusual. He didn't fully believe in the founders, but he believed in Markula's judgment. This was a departure from his usual people-first approach. With Apple, he was making a second-order bet, betting on Markula's belief in Jobs and Wozniak rather than on Jobs and Wozniak directly. The market opportunity was clear. Personal computers were emerging. Apple II sales were accelerating. The technology worked. The question was whether the company could scale from garage startup to serious business, and whether Steve Jobs could mature into an effective leader. Rock also saw that while Jobs was rough around the edges, he had something valuable. Vision, intensity, and reality distortion field persuasiveness. Jobs believed Apple would change the world. That fire in the belly Rock always looked for, Jobs had it in abundance. What he lacked was experience, business discipline, and self-awareness. Rock invested $60,000 initially and bought 640,000 shares of Apple. He joined the board of directors in 1978. His role became part strategic advisor, part adult supervision. There are legendary stories from Rock's time on Apple's board. One board meeting, Jobs showed up without shoes. Rock stopped the meeting and told Jobs, "Steve, we're not starting until you go put on shoes." Jobs left, returned with shoes, and the meeting continued. Rock saw his job as helping Jobs grow up professionally while not killing the creativity and vision that made Jobs special. It was a delicate balance. Too much control would crush Jobs' genius. Too little would allow his immaturity to derail the company. Apple succeeded wildly in its early years. The Apple II became one of the best-selling computers of the early 1980s. The 1980 IPO made Jobs and Wozniak millionaires at ages 25 and 30. Rock's $60,000 investment became worth millions almost overnight. But success created new challenges. Jobs insisted on pursuing the Lisa computer and then the Macintosh, more sophisticated machines aimed at business users. The Lisa failed. The Macintosh launched in 1984 with great fanfare but struggled to gain market share against IBM PCs. By 1985, Apple was in crisis. Macintosh sales disappointed. Jobs was fighting with CEO John Shockley, whom the board had brought in to provide professional management. The board faced a choice: side with Jobs or with Shockley. Rock, along with the rest of the board, sided with Shockley. In May 1985, with Rock's encouragement, Shockley proposed removing Jobs from his role running the Macintosh division. Jobs was furious and felt betrayed, especially by Rock, with whom he developed a personal relationship. "We were very close," Rock later reflected. "I can't tell you how many dinners he had here, and we used to go out together. I introduced him to skiing. He came and stayed at our house in Aspen." But Rock believed the decision was necessary. "Everybody thinks we fired him, but we didn't. We told him that he couldn't run the company anymore." Jobs left Apple and founded Next Computer. Rock remained on the Apple board through the company's subsequent struggles. Rock's Apple investment was enormously profitable financially. His 640,000 shares purchased at early valuations, held through the 1980 IPO and subsequent splits, were worth tens of millions by the time he left the board in 1993. But the Jobs ouster decision haunted the board. Shockley initially stabilized Apple, but the company gradually lost its way in the late 1980s and 1990s. By 1997, Apple was near bankruptcy. The board brought Steve Jobs back. Jobs, now matured by failure and success at Pixar, led Apple's historic revival into the most valuable company in the world. Rock had left the board by then, but he watched as Jobs vindicated everything Rock had originally seen. Beneath the arrogance and immaturity was genuine genius. Jobs just needed time and painful lessons to become the leader Apple needed. Lessons that came through his exile from Apple, the failure of Next, and his success at Pixar. Apple taught Rock important lessons about the complexities of backing young founders. Trusting your instincts about people matters. Rock's initial instincts about Jobs being difficult were correct. That difficulty almost destroyed Apple in 1985. Young founders can grow but not always fast enough. Jobs eventually became the leader Rock hoped he could be, but it took exile from Apple and years of hard lessons to get there. Sometimes you bet on the recommender, not the founder. Marculla's judgment proved correct long-term, even though Rock had reservations. Board governance is painful. Removing Jobs in 1985 was the right decision for that moment, but it damaged relationships and led to Apple's decline. Great products don't guarantee great companies. Apple had brilliant products but struggled with management, strategy, and execution for years. Rock's Apple experience was more complex than his other investments. It was financially successful but operationally troubled, showing that even legendary investors make bets that work out in complicated ways. By the 1980s, Arthur Rock was in his 50s and 60s, financially secure beyond measure, and universally respected in Silicon Valley. He'd helped birth the semiconductor industry, the personal computer revolution, and the venture capital model itself. He could have retired comfortably. Instead, he continued investing on his own terms. Rock remained essentially a one-man operation with a small office and Marie Getchell as his only staff. He made 3 to 4 investments per year, all geographically close to San Francisco. He served on boards, provided advice, and worked with founders he respected on problems he found interesting. In 1975, at age 49, Rock married Toni Rem, a lawyer, in what would be a stable and happy second marriage. They had no children and built a life around art, culture, philanthropy, and outdoor activities. Rock exercised for an hour every morning and skied extensively in Aspen, where they owned a condominium. His personal life was balanced and fulfilling, allowing him to be selective about his professional commitments. Rock adapted by going even more niche. He didn't compete for hot deals or chase trends. He invested in opportunities that came through his network, where his relationships and reputation provided unique access that couldn't be replicated by larger, more institutional players. In the early 1980s, Rock invested in and became founding chairman of Diasonics, a medical device company developing MRI machines. MRI technology was revolutionary. It allowed doctors to see inside the human body without surgery or radiation. Rock saw huge potential in the market. The management team was impressive technically. They understood the physics and engineering challenges involved in building these complex machines. They built working MRI machines that produced clear images. Early customers loved the product. Rock's thesis was that MRI would become standard medical technology. Being early in the market would provide lasting advantages. With his reputation and connections, Rock helped Diasonics raise capital and recruit talent to scale the business. Diasonics grew rapidly, going public in 1983 at a valuation over $1 billion. Rock's early investment appreciated dramatically. It looked like another home run for the legendary investor. Then it unraveled. The company's management became obsessed with meeting quarterly earnings estimates. The pressure to show growth led to accounting manipulations. Revenue was recognized prematurely. Expenses were hidden. The books were cooked to present a false picture of the company's health. When the truth emerged, Diasonics' stock collapsed. Investors sued. The company's reputation was destroyed. Rock, as founding chairman and board member, faced embarrassment and financial loss. The financial loss was significant. Rock's stake, once worth millions, became nearly worthless. But worse than the money was the reputational damage. Rock's name was associated with fraud. His judgment was questioned. After decades of near-perfect success, he'd been blindsided by management dishonesty. Personally, Rock was devastated. He prided himself on judging character, on knowing whether people were honest. The Diasonics management had fooled him completely. Lying to the board, manipulating financials, and prioritizing short-term stock price over long-term integrity. Rock didn't try to minimize the failure or shift blame. He acknowledged it publicly and analyzed what had gone wrong with characteristic honesty and thoroughness. He learned that the importance of the CFO couldn't be overstated. Diasonics lacked a strong, independent CFO who would push back against management's quarterly earnings obsession. Rock saw how short-term metrics corrupt decision-making. The pressure to meet Wall Street's quarterly expectations had corrupted management's judgment. He saw firsthand how damaging public market pressures could be for young technology companies. Rock also learned that character is hard to assess, even after decades of experience. He had misjudged these people. It was a humbling reminder that no investor, no matter how experienced, can fully eliminate the risk of working with dishonest actors. Diasonics taught Rock important lessons that made him even more careful in subsequent investments. He became more skeptical of management claims. He insisted on stronger financial controls and independent oversight. He was more cautious about companies facing quarterly earnings pressure. He valued integrity over optimism in ways he hadn't before. Years later, Rock would cite Diasonics as his most important learning experience. The failure, painful as it was, made him a better investor by exposing the limits of even the best judgment. It reinforced humility, always valuable but especially important when you have Rock's track record of success. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Rock continued making selective investments in companies. These later investments were generally smaller and less transformative than Rock's earlier work. By this point, Rock was wealthy and selective, not trying to build a new fortune but staying engaged with interesting people and technologies that captured his attention. Many of these investments were successful but not legendary. Returns were good, not spectacular. Rock was fine with that. He'd already had his legendary wins with Fairchild, Intel, Apple, and Scientific Data Systems. Now he was helping promising companies and staying connected to the technology industry he'd helped create. More interested in the work itself than in proving anything or accumulating more wealth. Arthur Rock is 98 years old as of 2024. He and his wife Toni Rem have devoted the last several decades to philanthropy, particularly in education. In 2003, Rock donated $25 million to Harvard Business School to establish the Arthur Rock Center for Entrepreneurship, which teaches entrepreneurship and provides resources for students starting companies. Together with Toni, Rock founded the Arthur and Toni Rem Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University, focused on improving corporate governance practices. A direct response to the Diasonics experience and other corporate scandals that highlighted the need for better oversight. Rock has been deeply involved in education reform, particularly for underserved communities. He co-founded and served as past president of the Basic Fund, which provides K-8 private school scholarships to inner-city children. He's been a board member of Teach for America, an active funder of KIPP charter schools, and a supporter of over 100 K-12 schools nationally. In 2022, he donated over $500,000 to San Francisco School Board recall elections, demonstrating his continued commitment to education reform and accountability in public institutions. Rock's track record is among the best in venture capital history. During the Davis and Rock years from 1961 to 1968, he invested $3 million in 15 companies and returned $100 million, achieving a 33 times return that established his reputation. His major winners included Scientific Data Systems with approximately 380 times return, Teledyne with strong multi-decade returns, Intel with estimated hundreds of millions in personal gains, and Apple with tens of millions from his early investment. Rock's investments helped create companies with combined market values in the trillions. Intel alone has created hundreds of billions in shareholder value. Apple became the most valuable company in the world. More importantly, Rock's investments created entire industries. Fairchild Semiconductor spawned Silicon Valley as dozens of employees left to start their own companies. Intel powered the PC revolution with its microprocessors. Apple transformed personal computing from a hobbyist activity into a mass-market phenomenon. The ripple effects of Rock's investments touched billions of lives through the products and technologies these companies created. Rock maintains a low public profile despite his legendary status. He rarely gives interviews and doesn't seek publicity. He was portrayed by J.K. Simmons in the 2013 film Jobs, an interesting historical footnote for someone who spent his career behind the scenes. In Silicon Valley, Rock is revered as a founding father whose influence shaped the entire ecosystem. Every venture capitalist studies his approach. Terms like people-first investing and hands-on value add trace directly to Rock's model of working with entrepreneurs. Rock's investment philosophy crystallized over decades into a set of core principles that defined his approach to venture capital. The foundation of everything was his belief that the quality of the entrepreneur matters infinitely more than the quality of the idea. This principle formed through Rock's early experiences on Wall Street analyzing companies but crystallized with the Fairchild Semiconductor deal, where he raised millions for the Traitorous 8 with virtually no business plan. Only the caliber of the people. Rock spent enormous time with entrepreneurs before investing through multiple meetings in different settings with repeated questions to see if answers stayed consistent. He wasn't trying to understand the business model deeply, often lacking the technical expertise to do so. He was assessing whether the person had fire in their belly and intellect. Would they tell him the truth? Could they attract great people? Would they persevere through inevitable obstacles? The Intel example epitomized this approach. Rock raised $2.5 million in 2 hours with a page-and-a-half memo because Bob Noyce's reputation was enough. The business plan barely mattered when Noyce and more were the investment thesis itself. Rock's second core principle was that he got his kicks out of building companies, not making money. The money, he believed, was a consequence of building companies successfully. This philosophy originated in Rock's Wall Street experience, which showed him that most investors were purely financially motivated. Analyzing securities, chasing returns, but disconnected from actual value creation. When Rock started working with entrepreneurs, he found building companies more satisfying than trading stocks. He refused to talk to entrepreneurs who led with "you're going to make a lot of money." He wanted people passionate about their product, their market, their vision. Money as a byproduct of building something important rather than the primary motivation. The third principle Rock lived by was to invest only in opportunities that have no limit. He realized early that in venture capital, returns are extremely skewed. One Intel returns more than dozens of modest successes. So every investment should have potential to become enormous. Rock looked for businesses in large, growing markets with potential for dominant positions, avoiding niche businesses or lifestyle companies that couldn't scale to billions in value. Intel was in semiconductors, a massive, critical, rapidly growing industry where even a modest market share would create enormous value. Rock's fourth principle was that the best investments take no time to decide. When everything aligns, great people, huge market, perfect timing, the decision is obvious and should be made quickly. This principle emerged from the Intel fundraise where Rock raised $2.5 million in 2 hours because the opportunity was so obviously right. Hesitation would have meant missing it. Rock trained himself to recognize when an opportunity met all his criteria, moving instantly when it did and passing quickly when it didn't. The middle ground of deals that required extensive analysis and persuasion were usually mediocre. The fifth principle Rock followed was to be useful or get out of the way. As an investor, he believed you should add real value through governance, advice, and connections. Or you shouldn't invest at all. Passive capital isn't enough. Rock's board work at Fairchild, Intel, and Apple showed him that involved board members who provided strategic counsel and recruited talent were far more valuable than passive investors. Rock only invested in companies near San Francisco so he could be actively involved, joining boards, attending meetings regularly, making introductions, and providing advice. He saw himself as a partner in building the company, not just a financier. At Intel, Rock served as chairman for decades, providing strategic guidance through multiple technological transitions and helping recruit key executives. The nuance was that active didn't mean controlling. Rock never tried to tell Noyce how to design semiconductors or Jobs how to design computers. He focused on governance, strategy, and management issues where his expertise was relevant. Rock's sixth principle was that character reveals itself under pressure. He learned through watching countless entrepreneurs through business cycles, crises, and competitive threats that how they handle failure, stress, and setbacks tells you more about them than how they handle success. The best entrepreneurs responded with honesty, adaptation, and resilience. Weak ones blamed others or gave up. Rock deliberately asked entrepreneurs about their failures and mistakes. He wanted to see if they'd take responsibility or make excuses. He watched how they handled board challenges. Were they defensive or receptive? During Intel's crisis in the 1980s when Japanese competition threatened their memory business, management's willingness to pivot to microprocessors showed strength that many companies would have lacked. They would have stubbornly defended their original strategy to failure. Rock learned from Dear Sonics, however, that some people hide their true character very effectively. Even experienced investors can be fooled. The principle holds, but with humility about its limitations. Rock's seventh principle was that options for everyone builds great companies. Broadly sharing equity with all employees creates alignment and attracts exceptional talent. Rock institutionalized this practice starting with Fairchild Semiconductor and codified it at Intel, pioneering what would become standard practice. Before Rock, stock options were typically limited to top executives. Rock pushed portfolio companies to grant meaningful equity to all employees with 4-year vesting and a 1-year cliff. This became standard practice in Silicon Valley because it worked. Employees who owned equity worked harder and stayed longer. Intel's broad option grants helped it recruit the best engineers from competitors. The financial upside from stock appreciation made Intel careers extraordinarily lucrative for early employees. Rock balanced founder ownership to maintain control and motivation with employee ownership to attract talent and investor returns to ensure capital providers were rewarded. Rock's insights about evaluating entrepreneurs revealed his deep understanding of human nature and business success. He acknowledged his limitations. I'm not enough of a technologist to understand what most of these entrepreneurs are about technically. So I spend a lot of time with them. Meeting multiple times, asking the same questions, seeing if answers stay consistent. I want to see fire in their belly and intellect. Fire alone isn't enough. Lots of people have passion but no ability. Intellect alone isn't enough. Smart people without drive don't build great companies. You need both. On market timing, Rock understood the delicate balance required for successful entry. You want to be early but not too early. Too late means competition has established positions. Too early means you'll run out of money before the market arrives. The sweet spot is when the technology works, early customers exist, but the mass market is just forming. That's when great companies capture dominant positions. Rock's approach to decision-making was pragmatic and nuanced. Most decisions aren't permanent. You can adjust as new information arrives. But some decisions, like who you partner with, are hard to reverse. That's where you slow down and really assess. Can I work with this person for a decade? Do I trust them when things go wrong? If the answer isn't obviously yes, it should be no. On failure, Rock demonstrated remarkable humility and willingness to learn. Everyone fails. What matters is what you learn. After Diasonics, I became more skeptical but also more humble. I'd been too confident in my ability to judge character. That confidence had blinded me. The experience made me better. More careful, more questioning, more aware of what I don't know. Examining Rock's best investments reveals consistent patterns that explain his extraordinary success. The people he backed all shared common traits. Bob Noyce at Fairchild and Intel. Gordon Moore at Fairchild and Intel. Henry Singleton at Teledyne. Max Palevsky at Scientific Data Systems. They combined technical brilliance with business acuity. They demonstrated relentless drive. They possessed the ability to attract talent. They maintained unwavering integrity even under pressure. Rock's genius was in recognizing these qualities and betting heavily on them. The markets Rock chose were invariably large and growing. Semiconductors at Fairchild and Intel represented the foundation of modern computing. The computing industry at SDS and Apple was expanding rapidly. Industrial conglomerates at Teledyne operated across massive markets. Rock never invested in small or declining markets because he needed industries that could support billion-dollar outcomes. Rock's strategic timing was uncanny. Fairchild came right as semiconductor technology became commercially viable. Intel emerged right as computing demand exploded. Apple caught the early days of personal computing. Rock positioned himself early enough to capture massive upside but late enough that fundamental technology worked and initial markets existed. Rock's active involvement distinguished him from passive investors. He served on the boards of all his major investments, often for decades. Not flipping companies for quick profits but building them alongside founders. This commitment created trust, provided continuity, and allowed Rock to add value beyond just capital. The meta lesson from Rock's career is that his true edge was judgment about people combined with positioning in the right industries at the right time. He couldn't predict specific technologies, but he could identify extraordinary people working on important problems in growing markets. That combination, repeated consistently over decades, created historic returns and transformed entire industries. Rock's direct impact on the business world is almost impossible to overstate. The companies he built or enabled include Fairchild Semiconductor, which was the genesis of Silicon Valley itself. Intel, which became the dominant semiconductor company. Apple, which grew into the world's most valuable company. Teledyne, which became a successful conglomerate. Scientific Data Systems, which was a major computer company. And dozens of spin-offs from Fairchild alumni who went on to found their own successful companies. The economic value Rock's investments created is staggering. Trillions of dollars in market value and millions of jobs. Intel and Apple alone employ hundreds of thousands of people globally and have generated enormous wealth for shareholders, employees, and communities. The technologies these companies developed, microprocessors, personal computers, smartphones, have transformed how billions of people live and work. Rock's work helped create the semiconductor industry itself, Silicon Valley as a geographic and cultural phenomenon, the venture capital industry as a professional practice, and the startup ecosystem model that now exists worldwide. Rock's intellectual legacy extends beyond any single company or investment. The ideas and frameworks he pioneered, the people over ideas investment thesis, the fire in their belly and intellect founder assessment framework, broad employee stock options as standard practice, for-year vesting with 1-year cliff, active board involvement as the investor's role, and even the term venture capitalist itself, which Rock is credited with coining or popularizing, have become foundational to how venture capital works today. Rock's influence on the industry is evident in how every venture capitalist studies his methods. Firms like Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins, and Andreessen Horowitz built on foundations Rock established. His students and colleagues carried his philosophy forward in ways that multiplied his impact. The Fairchild Semiconductor Alumni Network, known as the Fairchildren, founded dozens of companies that became pillars of Silicon Valley. Intel executives like Andy Grove spread Rock's management philosophies throughout the technology industry. Venture capitalists who watched Rock work adopted his people-first approach and made it the dominant paradigm in startup investing. Rock's cultural influence extended beyond business practices to shape the very nature of Silicon Valley itself. He demonstrated that finance could be creative and constructive, not just extractive. He showed that backing entrepreneurs and building companies was more valuable and satisfying than trading securities. He helped create the culture of Silicon Valley. Risk-taking, meritocratic, focused on building the future rather than managing the past. The decision to let the Traitorous 8 leave a Nobel laureate to start their own company, rather than enforcing loyalty and hierarchy, became the template for how Silicon Valley handles talent and innovation. Rock's later life focus on education reform, particularly for underserved children, reflects his core values and life experience. His own path from candy store to Harvard Business School to venture capital legend was only possible because of educational access through the GI Bill. He's spent decades working to provide similar opportunities to others. Recognizing that talent is distributed equally but opportunity is not. Rock's reflections on success reveal a man who found meaning beyond wealth accumulation. Success in venture capital isn't about making money, though I've made plenty. It's about helping build companies that matter. When I see an Intel chip or an Apple product, I know I played a small role in making that exist. That's the satisfaction. Rock never chased wealth for its own sake. He lived comfortably but not ostentatiously. He drove a Honda, not a Ferrari. He kept a modest office and lived with understated elegance. What motivated him was building things that lasted, creating value that extended beyond his own lifetime. On failure, Rock demonstrated the intellectual honesty that characterized his entire career. Diasonics taught me humility. I'd been successful for so long that I'd become overconfident. I thought I could always spot dishonesty. I was wrong. That failure, painful as it was, made me better. It taught me to stay humble, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning. Rock's emphasis on relationships over transactions distinguished him throughout his career. The best investments come from relationships, not from pitch meetings. I backed Bob Noyce because I knew him, hiked with him, trusted him. We'd built a relationship over years. When he called about Intel, I didn't need to think. I knew him, and I knew I wanted to work with him again. On work-life balance, Rock's choices reflected his priorities. He married late, with his first marriage ending in divorce, then remarried successfully to Tony Rem. He had no children but maintained serious hobbies including hiking, skiing, and art collecting. He exercised daily and made time for life outside work. Rock explained his philosophy. I never wanted to build a big firm. I wanted to work with interesting people on interesting problems. That meant staying small, staying selective, having time for life outside work. I never regretted that choice. Rock's thoughts on meaning and legacy revealed what mattered most to him. What matters in the end? Companies that created value, technologies that improved lives, people who were given chances to build something. That's the legacy. The money is nice, but it's a byproduct. The companies are what matter. Rock understood that his legacy wasn't his personal wealth. It was Intel, Apple, and the dozens of companies that sprang from investments he'd made. Those companies employed millions, created products used by billions, and advanced human capability in ways that would outlast any individual fortune. Rock's investment wisdom offers timeless lessons for anyone involved in building or funding companies. His first and most important lesson is that people are the investment, not the business plan. Rock raised $2.5 million for Intel in 2 hours with a page-and-a-half memo because Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore were the investment. The plan was secondary. This pattern repeated throughout his career. He invested in Max Palevsky, Henry Singleton, and Bob Noyce, always putting people first and ideas second. Modern venture capital has sometimes forgotten this, chasing hot markets and innovative technologies while underweighting founder quality. Rock would argue this is backwards. Exceptional people in promising fields will figure out how to succeed even if the original plan changes. The second lesson is to be early but not too early. Timing is everything. Fairchild Semiconductor succeeded because the technology was ready and the market was forming. Companies that were 5 years earlier would have failed due to immature technology. Those 5 years later would have faced entrenched competition. Rock had an instinct for the inflection point when technology matured enough to be reliable but early enough that markets were open. This timing sense, the ability to recognize when the pieces are aligned, is rare and valuable and explains why so many of Rock's investments succeeded. Rock's third lesson is that active involvement creates better outcomes than passive capital. Rock joined boards, provided strategic counsel, made introductions, and helped recruit talent. He wasn't just financing companies. He was helping build them. His geographic discipline of only investing near San Francisco enabled this involvement. Modern venture capitalists who sit on 20 boards and make 50 investments cannot provide the same depth of engagement. Rock's model of fewer deals and deeper involvement created better companies and better returns because he could actually add value beyond money. The fourth lesson Rock teaches is that the best investments require no deliberation. When Rock got the call from Bob Noyce about Intel, he didn't need to think. He knew immediately it was right. This pattern of instant recognition of extraordinary opportunities repeated throughout his career. The deals that required extensive analysis and convincing were usually mediocre. The great ones were obvious if you'd done the preparation to recognize them. This doesn't mean being impulsive but rather developing such deep knowledge and judgment that exceptional opportunities become immediately apparent. Rock's fifth lesson concerns deal structure. Structure deals to align incentives completely. Rock pioneered broad employee stock options, for-year vesting with 1-year cliffs, and meaningful founder ownership. This alignment created companies where everyone, founders, employees, investors, won together. Misaligned structures where investors capture most value or employees have no ownership create worse outcomes because they fail to motivate the people actually building the company. Rock understood that wealth creation should be broadly shared to maximize motivation and retention. The sixth lesson is to stay humble. Even the best judgment fails sometimes. Diasonics taught Rock that even after decades of success, he could be deceived. Character is hard to assess. Management can lie to boards. No investor, no matter how experienced, eliminates the risk of working with dishonest people. This humility, maintained even after legendary success, kept Rock learning throughout his career and prevented the arrogance that destroys many successful investors. Rock's life and career wisdom extends beyond investing to offer broader lessons. His seventh lesson is to build what brings satisfaction, not what maximizes revenue. Rock could have built a massive venture firm managing billions. He chose to stay small, invest his own money plus a few friends' capital, and work closely with a handful of companies. He sacrificed scale for quality of life and depth of involvement. This choice, optimizing for satisfaction rather than assets under management, is rare in finance but led to a more fulfilling career and, arguably, better investment outcomes. The eighth lesson is that relationships matter more than transactions. Rock's best investments came from people he knew personally. Bob Noyce, Henry Singleton, Mike Markula. These weren't transactional relationships developed for deal flow. They were genuine friendships built over years of hiking trips, dinners, and shared experiences. The trust built through real relationships created opportunities that couldn't be accessed through formal pitch processes or networking events. Investing in relationships pays dividends that can't be quantified on a spreadsheet. Rock's ninth lesson is that education and access create opportunity. Give back by expanding both. Rock's path from Rochester candy store to Harvard Business School was only possible because of the GI Bill, a public investment in education that created opportunity for millions. He spent his later life trying to provide similar opportunities to others through education reform and philanthropy. Success creates an obligation to expand access for those who follow, ensuring that talent from any background can achieve its potential. The 10th lesson Rock teaches is to stay engaged but know when to step back. Rock remained on Intel's board for over 30 years but knew when to transition from active investor to elder advisor. He didn't cling to relevance or try to control companies past his time. He provided continuity and wisdom while letting younger generations lead. This graceful evolution, staying engaged without overstaying, is rare and requires both self-awareness and genuine care for the institutions you've helped build. Rock's psychological insights offer additional wisdom. His 11th lesson is that fire in the belly and intellect, both are required. Rock's phrase captures something essential. Passion without capability produces failure. Capability without passion produces mediocrity. The combination of drive plus ability creates greatness. This insight applies beyond investing. In any field, the people who change things have both the will and the skill to do so. Neither alone is sufficient. The 12th lesson is that character reveals itself under pressure, not in pitch meetings. Rock's assessment process involved multiple meetings, repeated questions, and observing entrepreneurs in different contexts. He wanted to see how they handled challenges, whether their stories stayed consistent, and if they took responsibility for failures. This approach recognized that character is hard to fake over time and under stress. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior under pressure, which is why Rock spent so much time with entrepreneurs before investing. Rock's 13th and final lesson is that overconfidence is the enemy of continued success. His Diasonics experience, coming after decades of success, taught him that early wins can create dangerous overconfidence. He'd started believing his judgment was nearly infallible. That belief blinded him to warning signs. The failure humbled him and made him more careful. The lesson applies universally. Success should create confidence but not arrogance. Stay questioning, stay humble, and stay open to being wrong, no matter how much you've achieved. Arthur Rock's life illuminates fundamental truths about investing, building companies, and creating lasting value that transcend his specific investments and era. On investing, Rock proved that venture capital done right is about people, judgment, and building relationships, not about financial engineering or complex analysis. The best investments come from knowing exceptional people and backing them in important endeavors. This approach requires patience, selectivity, and deep involvement. It can't be scaled infinitely, but it creates extraordinary outcomes when executed with discipline and wisdom. Rock also demonstrated that getting rich is a byproduct of building valuable things, not a goal in itself. He never chased money for its own sake but instead chased interesting problems, exceptional people, and the satisfaction of building companies that mattered. The wealth followed naturally as a consequence of creating real value. On human nature, Rock's career shows that character is the ultimate variable in business success. Technical brilliance matters. Market opportunities matter. Timing matters. But character determines how all those other factors are deployed. Integrity, drive, humility, and resilience. These traits separate great entrepreneurs from merely capable ones. Rock's failures, particularly Diasonics, also show that character is difficult to assess and can fool even the most experienced judges. This tension, character matters most, but character is hardest to evaluate accurately, is central to investing and to life itself. Rock's legacy is ultimately about companies and industries, not about financial returns. He helped create Silicon Valley by funding the Fairchild Semiconductor breakaway. He enabled Intel, which powered the computing revolution. He backed Apple early, helping launch personal computing. These companies created trillions in value, millions of jobs, and products that transformed civilization. The financial returns Rock earned were enormous, but they were a small fraction of the total value created. This is the nature of entrepreneurship and venture capital at its best. Investors earn good returns, but society captures most of the value through better products, more efficient industries, and expanded capabilities. Rock's character and legacy are inseparable from how he lived. He lived according to clear principles. Back exceptional people. Build lasting companies. Stay involved. Remain humble. Give back through philanthropy. He didn't always succeed. Diasonics failed. The Apple board's ouster of Steve Jobs proved premature. But he learned from failures and maintained his integrity throughout. His legacy isn't just the companies he funded or the wealth he created, but the model he established. Venture capital as a creative, constructive force that helps exceptional people build important things. That model has been replicated thousands of times, funding companies that have shaped the modern world. The human story behind the legend is equally compelling. Arthur Rock was the son of immigrants, raised behind the counter of a candy store in Rochester. No connections, no inherited wealth, no obvious path to influence. What he had was intelligence, judgment, and the ability to recognize exceptional people and opportunities. The GI Bill gave him access to education he couldn't have afforded otherwise. Harvard Business School gave him credentials and connections. Wall Street gave him training in finance and analysis. But what distinguished Rock wasn't any of those advantages. It was his instinct for people and his commitment to building rather than merely investing. Rock became wealthy beyond measure, but he never chased wealth for its own sake. He lived modestly, worked on problems he found interesting, built relationships he valued, and spent his later years trying to create opportunities for others through education reform. What did success cost him? A failed first marriage, decades of intense work, the stress of board battles and failed investments, and the realization that even his best judgment could fail. But what did success give him? The satisfaction of building companies that changed the world, relationships with some of the most brilliant people of his era, the financial freedom to focus on what mattered, and the knowledge that his work created value far beyond his personal returns. Where does Arthur Rock rank among great investors? In terms of pure financial returns, he's among the very best. 33 times on the Davis and Rock Fund, enormous personal wealth from Intel and Apple, and a track record few can match. But Rock's importance transcends returns. He was present at the creation, not just of successful companies, but of Silicon Valley itself and the venture capital industry that funds innovation. Without Rock, the Traitorous 8 might never have left Shockley. Fairchild might never have existed. Intel might never have been funded. Apple might have failed without board guidance. The template for how venture capital works, equity structures, board involvement, people-first investing, might have evolved differently. Rock was a first mover who established patterns that shaped an entire industry. Sequoia Capital, Kleiner Perkins, Andreessen Horowitz, all built on foundations Rock laid. In 50 years, when venture capital history is written, Arthur Rock will occupy a special place as the man who proved that backing exceptional people with capital and wisdom could build companies that changed the world. Arthur Rock's story matters because it shows that individuals can shape history. One person with good judgment, strong principles, and the courage to back exceptional people can enable the creation of industries and companies that transform civilization. It matters because it shows that success in investing isn't about complex financial models or insider information. It's about understanding people and having the wisdom to back the right ones. It matters because it demonstrates that building things creates more lasting satisfaction than merely accumulating wealth. And it matters because Rock's path, from candy store to Harvard to venture capital legend, shows that opportunity and education can transform lives. Rock never forgot that the GI Bill made his education possible. He spent his later years working to provide similar opportunities to others. Arthur Rock didn't set out to become a legend. He set out to do work he found interesting with people he respected. He wanted to build companies that mattered and help exceptional people achieve things they couldn't accomplish alone. In pursuing those modest goals consistently over 5 decades, he became one of the most important investors in history. He helped create Silicon Valley, enabled the semiconductor revolution, funded the companies that powered the PC era, and established the venture capital model that continues to fund innovation today. Not bad for the son of a candy store owner from Rochester. His life teaches a simple lesson. Find exceptional people working on important problems. Back them with capital and wisdom. Help them build something that lasts. Do this consistently, with integrity and humility, and the results will exceed anything you imagined. That's Arthur Rock's legacy, and that's why his story matters.